We are continuing with our discussion on the historic cities and heritage areas. We have been talking about Bologna and how what are the different instruments which have been there, and how the conservation has shifted from monument centric approach to the area based approach and historic cities and districts. We will continue with that. So, when this development was happening, a new concept came up which is known as the historic urban landscape concept. This historic urban landscape came because the social and cultural background of the 1972 World Heritage Convention had been considerably changing in the last decades of the 20th century, and that necessitated this need for this concept formally. The expansion of the notion of the cultural heritage led to the continuous redefinition of urban heritage. What is this urban heritage? That actually was debating, and as we are seeing that there are different charters and convention which is happening, and how it will be done, whether the fabric is important, whether life is important, and if the life is important and if it has to change, then what sort of a new areas, new activities, whether they can be built in the historic city. So, this debate has been going on. And that is why we see a continuous redefinition of what is this urban heritage. The protected city centers were no longer considered as merely aesthetically attractive or historically significant ensembles of buildings and monuments. We have to notice it is not, they are talking about not only aesthetics and not only historically significant ensemble, but as social habitats. Let us talk about in India only, Pondicherry. Pondicherry we know it is a very important tourism town now, French colony. But when we talk about Pondicherry, it is not only the French colony or the beautiful houses which are there, which has been preserved. A lot of this can be attributed to the in-tax contribution there. Many of these houses have been changed to the hotels, lodges and other things, but there is also a Tamil quarter which we see here. There is a Tamil quarter which also has been there. This is also part of Pondicherry, and these have been inherited by the people who own these houses. They have their own needs, demands and aspiration. There are not only residents, but there are school. Pondicherry is also important because of Rishi Aurobindo's connection, mother's ashram is there. There are multifarious activities which goes on there. So, this is not only the physical fabric, it is not only has its own importance as a history, layers of history, but they are the social habitats which should be preserved in harmony with their natural settings and through mobilizing their residing communities. So, again we are talking about this participation of the people, their needs, their aspiration, and not only the aesthetically important, this is important, but not the only thing, but also not only the historic, but as a social habitat. And this what historic urban landscape gives that as a concept. But one has to remember that this concept, though it had got a proper name in the, as an historic urban landscape concept, but it has been there. It has been there when we are talking about a Bologna, we have been talking, it was there, the debate has been going on, but we got a formal definition. So, let us see what is the definition. The historic urban landscape is the urban area understood as the result of a historic clearing of cultural and natural values and attributes. Historic clearing of cultural and natural values and attributes extending beyond the notion of the historic center or ensemble to include the broader urban context and its geographical setting. We have been talking about that when we have been talking about a Bologna, we have been talking about Assisi. So, this concept was there, it is not that it is something new. And it is talking about a layering, it is not only talking about one period of history. So, let us see what is the outcome of that, or when we are talking about such concept, what we have to face with, what are the issues which need to be addressed. Again we are talking about this Pondicherry, which I have been talking about. That Pondicherry, we can't only talk about the French Pondicherry, which is a very well defined area. We have to talk about the larger area, and that larger area means that we don't have to talk about only this area. We have to talk about the river which is there. We have to talk about the Tamil Quarter or the natural thing. We have to talking about how the city is expanding. We also have to talk about the smaller parts. We have to talk about the water body. So, all these are very important part of that when we talk about Pondicherry. We have to understand this layering, and then we have to say that okay, there are certain area which is distinctively of this character. There are certain area which is distinctively of that character. And when you are talking about this character or that character, it is not only the physical fabric, it is important, but who are staying there, what is their livelihood, what is their activity. This becomes a very important part of that when we are talking about the historic landscape and the layering of the cultural and the natural values and the attributes. So, what would make an urban area urban? What would make an urban area urban beyond architecture if possible, and that is what becomes the one of the major challenge. So, when we are talking about layering of the natural, historical and physical, social economic factors, actually we are talking about the urban dynamics. ICOMOS Brazilian seminar about the preservation and revitalization of historic center in Itaipava in 1987 talked about this. Some of the points which addressed: the city in its totality is a historical entity, dynamic process of successive transformations. So, let us see this one, Daman. Daman was a Portuguese settlement. There was a fort. We can see that some of the older structures are still there, and behind that the new multi-story structures are coming up. This is the physical outcome of this, and what also we have to understand that it is not only what it looks like, but if you seek very closely, there are certain activities. A small person, a tailor, has his small business in that veranda of that house. There is small sort of a commercial establishment or mixed type of residence which is happening there, and that is a very important component of this urban pattern. And what is happening due to this economics or the new type of development, unsympathetic development which is happening. I am not only talking about the physical one, the new type of residence, new types of activities which are happening is changing the entire relationship which has been developing the year. Change, because we are talking about the urban dynamics, it's absolutely it has to happen. But what is happening is this change is happening very in an ad hoc manner and in very abrupt way and drastically, and that is what is actually something to be concerned about. So, build space, when you are talking about this dynamic process of successive transformation, the build space thus is a physical result of a social productive process. So, when we are saying the build space, which is a product, but it is a product or a manifestation of a lot of factors, attributes which has been happening over the years. So, the idea is to understand those type of forces, what contributed to this overall built fabric, the activities, and what is happening now. One of the characteristics of the historic urban area is their intrinsic heterogeneity. Most of the time there are areas which can be homogeneous area in terms of their physical character, attributes and other, but most of the time, because we are talking about a layering or juxtaposition of the various historical layers where the economic, social structure could have been very different, there is an intrinsic heterogeneity of this area, and we have to remember and we have to identify what contributes to that heterogeneity. It is very rarely Jaisalmer or Jaipur we get some of the very homogeneous structure. There there are areas we have talked about SSC and others, but if you look closely there will be a heterogeneity in such an area. But to understand the degree of heterogeneity, degree of homogeneity and what contributes to this specific character. So, ICANO's Charter for Conservation of Historic Towns and Urban Area 1987, it talks about all urban communities, whether they have developed gradually over time or have been created deliberately, are an expression of the diversity of society throughout this history. And this diversity, the intrinsic heterogeneity, is a reflection of this diversity. As we have been talking about, some of the areas have been developed gradually. So, we will see the different layers. Some of the areas have been planned. So, from area to area, place to place, there will be a variation. But what is that variation? What is that heterogeneity? What is that layering? That and how this built not only the buildings, but the fabric, the road, the circulation system, activities, processional routes, how they have happened over the years, what is remaining and what is changing. This has to be identified. So, what is the definition of an historic urban landscape? What characterizes an historic urban landscape as an urban landscape? The ways in which the built and the open spaces have evolved over time, that is what have been and are the dynamics of evolution. So, we see that this is what we are trying to understand. What is this dynamic of evolution and the resulting patterns of marks left in the area. So, when we are trying to document or understand an historic area, this is our task, that out of the various forces over the years, what is this dynamics of evolution and what are the resulting patterns or marks left in the area. It has given that unique character to that area, and this is what is very important to identify. I am talking about the World Heritage City of Split, Croatia. I will not talk about much detail of that area. It is a World Heritage Site. It is known because there is a very early Roman ruins which have been there, but this area has been developing. There is a small core, historic core, which is a World Heritage Site. And outside that core, I have been once mentioning that area, there are the other developments which are happening. So, you can see there that in this area that this is nothing to do with the core, it is outside the area. So, there have been layers of history. So, what is an urban landscape considered to have been historicized based on the shared recognition of a living entity responding to the needs of population and force of the market. So, we cannot deny the forces of market, but we have to keep it under some sort of a, I will not use the word control, is there certain regulations that it does not totally disrupt the urban fabric or the unique identity of the places. So, as you can see in the old city core of Split, the street pattern, the building fabric, the narrow alleyways, the vistas, all are there, but they have been changed in their activities, they have become commercial, it is totally pedestrian within that core. But as we go outside of this historic core, the different layers of development which has been happening, and they also contribute to the unique character of that city. So, also we have to understand, when we are talking about the urban landscape, the functional and the visual relationship with its setting, which contributes to its meaning, significance and the values. So, we are talking about also not only the social or economic, but also the functional visual relationship with the setting. The setting is important, it can be a man-made setting, it can be a natural setting, but again the functional relationship and also the visual relationship are important to understand. Again, I am coming back to the definition of the historic urban landscape. What characterizes an historic urban landscape as an urban landscape? We have been talking about that. We are continuing with this. The visual perception of specific qualities in a particular land area, including spatially aesthetic seen in views. So, different view angles, not that everything. So, we have to see the height control or the envelope control, we have to see it from the various view cone as the people are approaching, and the geomorphology of the territory, the contours, it is a flat land, the surrounding areas, all are very important. So, the visual perception has to be understood. layers of history and evolution over time, the traces left by the different generations in response to the challenges offered by the natural environment. So, we must remember that when we are talking about the historic urban landscape, we are trying to talk about the manifestation of the dynamics which has been happening, the evolution which has been happening, and then see that what are the marks left out of that and how it contributes to the unique significance of that historic area. There may be one historic area, there are multiple historic area, there are the clusters of historic area. So, you have to understand that in totality and think that in terms of the visual perception, think that in terms of the evolution over time, think that in terms of the functional, economic, social linkages. Coming back to split again, as I have talked about that this is the most important part of the Roman remains which are there, and this is a very interesting story how the base has been excavated, the excavation, archaeological excavation has been going on, people still continue to stay in the surrounding area. But again, when we come out of this historical core, we see, for example, this particular National Theatre. This National Theatre was burned down, it was a much later time, it has been again rebuilt, reconstructed, and this is also part of this layering process. And then also a new development has come out. This is a shopping center which one can see, this is a part of the old wall which is still remaining there, and a new shopping center has come up integrating that outside the historic core. So, this we can talk about the buffer area, talked about another layer of the history. And this to happen, one has to take recourse to the legal and administrative framework. If required, it has to be revised. In any case, the conservation of our heritage, material and immaterial, because we are talking about values, practices, activities, is necessarily based on communication and building of attitude. This is most important. Whatever systematic analysis we do, whatever legal and financial instrument is implemented, without changing the attitudes of the local residents, making them aware, involving the local people, the younger generation, this cannot happen. So, this is a very important part when we are talking about the conservation and preservation of the historic areas. So, what characteristics we have talking about that? So, let us see some of the summing up that when we are faced with certain situation or challenge like that, what we have to do? Define the specificity of each area in order to adopt them to proper policies and strategies. Undertake a survey of the area as a whole, including an analysis of its spatial evolution. So, in this particular example, we are again talking about split. So, what has been done is that is the historic core of the split, and some only of the boundary walls are still remaining, some is missing, but within that whatever is remaining, they are from the different layers. So, this has been documented and understood, and some of the areas it is either non-descriptive or there is some things. There are the patterns, the movement patterns, the open areas, there is a connection between this part of the city with that part of the city. So, all the movement pattern, activity pattern, this has been systematically analyzed in this case to give a development or policy, so that these historic core of split becomes a part of the larger town or split. So, what has been done there, many of this town historic places, not this is the most important, but there are a lot of museums there in that area, but many of these are being converted into the cultural center, academic institution, and the housing for the students, homestays also are there. These all have been preserved and the new developments are coming, and this is entirely pedestrian area and which has been possible. And then once it goes out, then there are the other layers of history. So, the survey of the area as a whole, including an analysis of its spatial evolution. Another interesting thing happened in the area. In this particular area, that area was in a very deteriorated condition, and it was found that they are mainly but have been converted into a godown. Earlier there was a residential area, and as people started moving out of that area, the people from the outer areas, the laborers and other low income group of people have been staying there, and most of the ground floor of these areas were locked and were converted into godown, and that actually caused the deterioration of the structure. So, when this area was taken, totally documented, and there was an idea and a proper planning and a strategy to convert that in housing in collaboration with the funding from the housing authority, the National Housing Bank, something like that, so that it can become a proper residential area, not to demolish that, but to conserve that, restore that and make that habitable, so that it becomes a lived in place. These are very important strategic policies which kept split the way what we see. Of course, it has become a very well known, very popular tourist destination. In the tourism season, people come there, and I visited that area. So, what happens during the tourism time, some of the people rent out their apartments and go out of that area. This is one of the major issue, but this is also the economy of that area. But as a whole, there are new developments. It's not only totally tourism based, there are the cultural institution, academic institution, commercial area. As a whole, we can see that it has become a living, very popular destination and a lived in place. Again, I am coming back to these tips. So, what is important to make this thing happen is the surveys of social, economic, cultural and technical data and structures, and of the wider urban or regional. And when the split study was being taken or done, it was done in the context of the entire territory, going back to the evolution origin of the split, under what condition it flourished, what were the economies over the various times, and also some of the time it was underway various disturbances and what contributed to that. It was analyzed in a larger regional scale as well as a micro scale. So, in some of the times we are very fortunate that we get the plans of that area to see that how it has been developed, but in some cases we are not so fortunate. Most of the time no plans have survived. In such cases, it is very important to undertake a systematic architectural survey of the built areas and open spaces in order to identify the underlying regulation. This regulation may not be written regulation, but there were regulation, there is a code of how this will be built, which might have changed over the years. So, one has to, through this documentation and interlinking that with the various factors, one has to discover this underlying regulation, and in order to have a proper reference for the development of the planning tools that take into account the specific character and requirements of each area. Each and every area is very different, each and every city is very different, and even within a city, each and every area may have their own significance. We have to understand that in terms of again I am saying the various forces and how it has contributed to what we see today. We come back to what we have been seeing in Calcutta. We have seen this Calcutta, it is a traditional neighborhood, North Calcutta, still so beautiful, not only because of the fabric, but because of the community who are living, the values they have. They have been staying there for generation. The changes have been happening there, but changes have been happening slowly. But what is happening because of this proper policy and regulation and instruments, suddenly the ad hoc developments which are happening there. And this is something which, if not taken care of, can change the entire identity and significance of that area. And in such cases, what we have been discussing about, these cases become sort of a model which cannot be imitated, it has to be understood. The steps have to be understood, and then one has to see that in these specific circumstances, what are the legal, financial, administrative tools which are required, and how we can involve the local communities. Very recently, some of the artist groups they are involving the local community, trying to revive the old custom, making them aware of their tradition, making them aware of their own unique identity. So that this is one of the things which has to bottom up approach and which can happen. So, what would make an urban area urban beyond architecture in an Indian scenario? We have to understand this. In our following lectures, we may take up 1 or 2 Indian scenarios to understand that what are the issues of the historic area and how we can incorporate or we can learn from some of the examples in our context, and what are the steps to be taken, and if some steps have been already taken. I am referring for this particular lecture, last 2 lectures I have been referring Professor Oculata's this particular article, this very useful article. I have given the reference, you can download that and see it actually systematically analyzes the development over the years in the last few decades of this concept of the historic area, the concept of the historic districts, and how it has been evolving, what are the convention charters, what I have talked about and tried to summarize in the last 2 lectures. Thank you.